Three kids disappeared in the Arizona desert in 1990. No trace, no suspects. Case goes cold. 35 years later, construction workers find them 4 feet underground, half a mile from where they vanished. Someone in this community knew the whole time. This is who. The morning Rose Delgado brought homemade tamales to her neighbors on Sycamore Street. The air in Coyote Flats smelled like creosote after rain, even though it hadn't rained in 11 days. It was the kind of morning that made people in small Arizona towns feel briefly generous, briefly connected to something larger than the slow grind of desert life. Rose was 63, recently retired from the county clerk's office, and she'd decided that retirement meant cooking for other people, whether they wanted it or not. She worked her way down the block with a foil-covered pan balanced in both hands, stopping at each door, exchanging a few words, accepting coffee she didn't need. At the corner house, the one with the collapsed porch railing that Leonard Marsh had been promising to fix since Easter, she stopped and listened. A backhoe was working somewhere beyond the ridge, maybe half a mile east, where the county had been grading a new access road through the old scrubland. She could hear the engine turning over in the quiet morning air, a low mechanical growl that seemed out of place against the stillness of the desert. She thought nothing of it. Construction had been going on for weeks out there. She was home by 8:30, washing her hands at the kitchen sink and watching a pair of crows argue over something in the dry yard, when her phone rang. It was her cousin Teresa, who worked dispatch for the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department. Teresa's voice was different from usual, flat and careful in the way that people make their voices when they're trying to hold something back. "You should probably stay inside today," Teresa said. They found something out near the Dillon Road site. Rose dried her hands slowly. Found what? Teresa paused. "They're not sure yet, but it's bad, Rose. It's real bad." Rose stood at her sink for a long moment after the call ended, looking out at the 2 crows. One of them had found whatever it was they'd been fighting over and was pulling at it methodically, without hurry. The other had given up and was watching from the fence post with what looked, at that distance, like patience. By 10 o'clock, 3 patrol units had blocked off the Dillon Road site. By noon, the medical examiner's van from Prescott had arrived, raising a small dust cloud as it turned off the paved road and onto the grated dirt. And by mid-afternoon, when the shadows of the saguaro cacti began to lean east and the temperature finally started its slow retreat from 104 degrees, the word had spread through Coyote Flats, the way words always spread in towns with fewer than 3,000 residents. Something had been found in the ground, something that had been waiting there for a very long time. The backhoe operator's name was Ernesto Vega. He was 47 years old and had been grading desert roads for 20 years. He knew the ground out here the way a reader knows a familiar book, the texture of it, the way it resisted or yielded, the difference between caliche hardpan and sandy wash fill. What his bucket pulled up at 11:17 that morning was neither of those things. He'd felt the resistance first, that particular jar that ran up through the hydraulic arms and into the cab, a solid catch that was wrong in a way he understood immediately, even before he could name it. He reversed, repositioned, tried again at a different angle. The bucket scraped along something curved and hollow-sounding. He shut down the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence, listening to the desert settle around him. Then he climbed down. The object was underground storage of some kind. He could see that much. Fiberglass, old and pitted, the surface cracked in 2 places by his bucket. Through the larger crack, he could see darkness and something paler than the surrounding earth. He stood over it for 3 or 4 seconds. Then he walked back to his truck and called 911. He told the dispatcher he'd found what looked like an old water tank. He told her there was something inside it. He used a very neutral voice for this, the voice of a man who had decided, during those 3 or 4 seconds of standing over the cracked tank, that he did not want to know any more than he already knew. Detective Mark Sullivan arrived at the site at 4:15 in the afternoon. He was 52 years old, lean in the way that desert people sometimes get lean, as if the dry air had slowly reduced him to essentials. He wore no jacket, despite the badge clipped to his belt and the department-issue sidearm on his hip. He drove a 12-year-old Dodge that had accumulated 140,000 miles on roads exactly like this one, red and pale tan and bone-colored under a sky that had turned a deep copper with the lowering sun. He stood at the edge of the excavation and looked down without speaking for a long time. Beside him, Deputy Carla Reyes was making notes on a clipboard, her pen moving steadily, even though her face had gone very still. "The ME's already confirmed?" Sullivan said. "Preliminary. 3 sets of juvenile remains. She estimates they've been down there somewhere between 25 and 35 years. Sullivan crouched at the edge of the pit, studying the interior of the cracked tank through the crime scene tech's portable light. The plastic sheeting was almost entirely degraded, but he could see the shapes beneath it clearly enough. 3 small forms, positioned side by side in the sealed darkness. Someone had put them there with care. That was the detail that registered most sharply. Not haste, care. "Who owned this land?" he asked. Reyes checked her notes. "Current owner is a development company out of Scottsdale, purchased 18 months ago from a trust. Before the trust, it was held by a family named Parker, Delia Parker, deceased 2019. Before her, her husband Daniel Parker, deceased 2001. Sullivan stood up slowly, his knees registering the movement in a way they hadn't 10 years ago. He looked out across the scrubland, past the line of orange construction cones and the idle machinery, toward the ridge where the last of the afternoon light was burning itself out against the red rock. 3 children, he said, missing from this area. From Coyote Flats and the surrounding region, Reyes confirmed. The case is 34 years old. The children were listed as lost in the desert. Search parties went out for 2 weeks. No remains, no evidence of foul play. It was eventually categorized as a tragic accident. 3 kids wandering off from a summer campsite and not making it back. Sullivan turned away from the ridge. His eyes were flat and tired and very focused. "Get me the original files," he said. "Everything. And get me the camp records, whatever still exists. Who ran the camp in 1990? Who else was on that property? Who was questioned and what they said?" He looked back at the excavation one last time, at the careful arrangement of 3 small forms in the sealed darkness 34 years below the Arizona ground. "This was not an accident," he said. The Yavapai County Sheriff's Department archives occupied 3 rooms in the basement of the main building in Prescott, and they smelled the way rooms smell when paper sits undisturbed for decades in a dry climate. Not decay exactly, but a kind of suspended time, as if the documents inside were waiting for something they had always known would eventually arrive. Sullivan spent the first full day in those rooms. He brought coffee he didn't drink, and a yellow legal pad he filled from top to bottom with notes in his tight, compressed handwriting. He worked through the original case files the way he always worked through cold evidence, slowly, without assumptions, treating each document as a possible lie until it proved itself otherwise. The 3 missing children were named Tyler Ramos, age 9, Caitlin Moore, age 8, and Owen DeLuca, age 7. They had disappeared from the Redstone Valley Youth Camp on the night of July 14, 1990. The camp was a small, private operation that ran 2-week sessions for children from the surrounding region, set on 40 acres of scrubland adjacent to what was then the Parker family property. The final confirmed sighting of all three children was at approximately 9 p.m., when the camp director, a man named Roy Sutter, had done a head count after the evening fire. By morning, they were gone. The initial investigation notes were extensive in volume, but shallow in execution. Sullivan recognized the pattern immediately, a wide funnel narrowing too quickly to a single theory. Someone, early in the process, had decided that three young children wandering into the desert at night was a plausible explanation, and everything that followed had been organized to support that conclusion rather than to challenge it. Witness interviews were brief. The Parker property adjacent to the camp had been noted but not searched. Roy Sutter, the camp director, had been interviewed once and not followed up with. A man named Carl Brooks, listed as a camp groundskeeper and maintenance worker, had provided a one-page statement confirming he'd seen nothing unusual that evening. Sullivan read Carl Brooks's statement 3 times. There was something too careful about it. The language was specific in some places and vague in others, in a way that suggested the specificity was calculated. "I was in my cabin from 8 p.m. onward," Brooks had written. "I did not hear anything unusual. I have no information relevant to the disappearance of the children." Sullivan circled the last sentence. Witnesses who have no relevant information do not typically feel the need to assert that they have no relevant information. They answer the questions they're asked. They don't volunteer the absence of knowledge. The volunteering of that absence was, in Sullivan's experience, almost always a form of preemptive self-protection. He made a note. Carl Brooks, current location unknown. The DNA confirmation came on the 3rd day. Dr. Amara Osei, the Yavapai County medical examiner, delivered the results in person, which told Sullivan more than the results themselves did. She was a precise woman who communicated through email when precision was sufficient. When she drove 40 minutes to stand in his office and look at him directly, it meant the results were not sufficient on their own. "It's them," she said. "Tyler Ramos, Caitlin Moore, Owen DeLuca. Mitochondrial DNA from 2 of the 3 families. Full confirmation will take another 72 hours, but I'm not going to wait 72 hours to tell you what I already know." Cause of death? She sat down without being invited, which was also unusual. All 3 show evidence of asphyxiation. There is perimortem bruising to the soft tissue, partially preserved due to the sealed environment of the tank. They were suffocated, Mark, each of them, and they were placed in that tank deliberately, wrapped and arranged after death. She paused. This was not a tragic accident. Someone killed 3 children and hid them in the ground, and everyone who looked at this case in 1990 either missed it or chose not to look hard enough. Sullivan was quiet for a moment. "I'm reopening everything," he said. "I know. That's why I drove here." She stood, and he could see the effort it cost her to maintain her professional composure. She had 2 children of her own, he knew that. "Whatever you need from me, Mark. Anything at all." After she left, Sullivan stood at his office window, looking out at the parking lot and beyond it at the ridge of red rock that flanked the town's western edge. The afternoon sun was doing what it did to those rocks every day at this hour, turning them the color of old blood. He'd looked at that ridge 10,000 times from this window, and he'd never thought much about it. Today, it felt different. Today it felt like something that had been watching him while he wasn't paying attention. He turned back to his desk and his notes. Carl Brooks, current location unknown. He picked up his phone and started making calls. She came in on a Wednesday morning, 9 days after the discovery. Sullivan was at his desk when Deputy Reyes knocked on his open door and told him there was a woman in the lobby who wanted to speak with someone about the Redstone Valley case. She'd given her name as Hannah Brooks. Sullivan felt something shift very slightly in his chest, the way a key feels when it encounters the right lock. He told Reyes to bring her back. Hannah Brooks was 45 years old, and she looked like someone who had spent a long time being careful. Not afraid, exactly, but carefully contained, as if she had learned very early that the space she occupied needed to be managed precisely. She was of medium height, with dark hair showing the first threads of gray, and she wore the kind of clothes that were chosen not to be noticed. She sat down across from Sullivan's desk and placed her hands flat on her thighs and looked at him with the steady, evaluating look of someone who had been deciding for a long time whether to be in this room. "You're Carl Brooks's stepdaughter," Sullivan said. Her expression shifted fractionally. "You found me quickly." "I was looking." He kept his voice level. "I want you to know this is not an interrogation. You came here voluntarily. You can leave whenever you want. But I think you have something to tell me, and I think you've been carrying it for a long time." Hannah was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands on her thighs, then back at him. "I was 11 in the summer of 1990, she said. "My mother had been married to Carl for 2 years. We lived in a double-wide about 3 miles from the Redstone Valley camp. Carl worked there summers and did odd jobs for different ranches the rest of the year. My mother thought he was steady and reliable." She stopped. "She was wrong about that. But that's not what I came to tell you." "Tell me what you came to tell me." "The night those children disappeared, I couldn't sleep. The heat was bad that year, worse than usual, and our swamp cooler had broken, and Carl hadn't fixed it even though my mother had asked him 4 times. I was lying on top of my sheets at around midnight when I heard his truck start up outside. That wasn't unusual. He went out at strange hours sometimes. But something made me get up and look out the window." She paused here, and Sullivan watched her carefully. The pause was not dramatic. It was the pause of someone navigating real memory, the kind that had texture and weight and associated sensation. He was walking away from the truck toward the tree line at the back of the property. He was carrying something. It was long, maybe 4 feet, wrapped in something dark like canvas or heavy plastic. He was carrying it in front of him with both arms because it was heavy. I could see that from the way he was walking, bent forward against the weight of it. She met Sullivan's eyes. "I was 11 years old, and I watched my stepfather carry something heavy into the trees in the middle of the night, and I knew something was wrong with what I was seeing. I knew it the way children know things, in my body before I had words for it." "Did you say anything to him?" "The next morning I asked him where he'd gone in the night. He looked at me for a long time before he answered. He said I'd been dreaming, that I needed to stop making up stories. But it was the way he looked at me when he said it." She shook her head slowly. "I wasn't making anything up, and he knew I knew it. After that, he watched me differently. Not threatening exactly, but watchful, like I was a variable he needed to track." Sullivan wrote carefully on his legal pad without looking away from her. "When did you first connect what you saw to the missing children?" "When the news broke about them disappearing, a few days after. I was 11, not stupid. I knew what I'd seen. But I also knew that telling someone meant pointing a finger at Carl, which meant what it meant for my mother, for our lives." She looked at her hands again. "I talked myself into believing I'd misremembered, that it had been a camping bag, tools, something ordinary. I got very good at believing that over the years." She paused. "I'm a nurse now. I work in pediatric care. I have spent 34 years taking care of children, and I think that's not an accident. I think it's what I did with what I knew and couldn't say." Sullivan put his pen down. "Hannah," he said, "where is Carl Brooks now?" "He's in Wickenburg. He drives a delivery truck. He's been married twice more since my mother. He has a good reputation locally." Her voice carried no bitterness, just a flat precision that cost her something to maintain. "He's been living his life without any interruption for 34 years. Carl Brooks was 68 years old, and looked like a man who had made a career out of not appearing remarkable. He was medium height, medium build, with close-cut gray hair and the careful, agreeable manner of someone who had learned that being unmemorable was a form of protection. He sat in Sullivan's interview room with his hands folded on the table and his expression composed into something that was meant to read as cooperative concern. Sullivan had interviewed men like this before. The composure was never total. It was maintained at a cost, and the cost showed in specific places if you watched carefully enough. In the way the fingers tightened almost imperceptibly when certain topics approached. In the slight increase in blink rate when a question landed too close to something true. "You worked at the Redstone Valley Youth Camp in the summer of 1990, Sullivan said. It was not a question. "I did," Brooks said. "I worked maintenance there for 2 summers, 1989 and 1990. "You were on the property the night of July 14th. "I was in my cabin. I gave a statement to that effect at the time. "You told investigators you heard nothing unusual and that you had no information relevant to the disappearance." Brooks nodded. "That's correct." Sullivan let the silence run for about 10 seconds, which was long enough to be uncomfortable without being long enough for a prepared person to interrupt it with a deflection. "Where did you go that night?" Sullivan said. The fingers tightened. "I didn't go anywhere. I was in my cabin." "You were seen leaving the property in your truck at approximately midnight. You were seen carrying something heavy toward the tree line before you left." Sullivan kept his voice completely neutral. "I want to give you the opportunity to explain that before I tell you what the forensic evidence shows." Something moved behind Brooks's eyes. Not panic, not quite, but a rapid internal calculation that showed at the edges of his controlled expression. He was deciding, Sullivan recognized, whether the witness was credible, whether it was someone he knew, whether 11 years old and 34 years of memory could be successfully challenged. "I don't know what you're referring to," Brooks said. The voice had changed texture, still controlled, but with a slightly different quality now, harder. "Carl." Sullivan leaned forward slightly. 3 children were found in a sealed underground tank on the Parker property, which borders the camp. They were wrapped and placed there deliberately. The medical examiner has confirmed they were asphyxiated before burial. We are going to establish a complete forensic timeline for that night. We are going to interview every person connected to that camp and that property. And somewhere in that process, the truth of what happened is going to become clear to everyone in this county. The only question for you, right now, is whether you want to be someone who helped us understand the truth, or whether you want to be someone we build the case around. Those are 2 very different positions. Brooks was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and showed something that might have been exhaustion. "I didn't kill those children," he said. "I want you to understand that before anything else. I didn't kill them. Tell me what you did." And slowly, with the careful pacing of a man who had spent 34 years knowing this conversation might eventually happen and preparing for it without ever quite preparing for it, Carl Brooks told his story. He had been approached by Daniel Parker on the night of July 14th. Parker owned the adjacent property and had various informal arrangements with the camp over the years: equipment sharing, water access, occasional labor. Brooks had known him for 2 summers and had accepted small payments for small favors, the kind of arrangement that accumulates quietly between men who work adjacent land in isolated country. Parker had come to his cabin at around 11:30. He'd been calm, which was the detail Brooks kept returning to. He should have been falling apart, and instead he was calm with a deliberate, controlled calmness that was worse than any agitation would have been. Parker had told him there had been an accident. He needed help moving something to the storage tank on his property. He would pay $500 that night and another $500 the following week. If Brooks refused, Parker said quietly, he had certain information about a dispute over camp funds that could make Brooks's life very complicated. Brooks had gone. He had helped carry the wrapped bundles to the tank. He had replaced the access cover and helped tamp dirt back over the disturbed ground. He had accepted the money. And he had told himself from that night forward that what Daniel Parker had described as an accident was, in fact, an accident, because the alternative to believing that was something he was not willing to carry. Sullivan said nothing for a long time after Brooks finished speaking. He looked at the man across the table, at the hands still folded with their careful composure, now slightly undone, at the face that had lived behind its pleasant unremarkability for 34 years. "Thank you for telling me that," Sullivan said finally. His voice was very quiet. "An officer will come in now and will begin the formal statement process." He stood, picked up his legal pad, and walked out into the corridor. He stood with his back against the wall for a moment, looking at the ceiling of the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department hallway. Through the interview room door, he could hear Brooks exhaling slowly, the release of someone who has finally put down something extremely heavy. Sullivan thought about Hannah, who was waiting in the lobby. He thought about what she had carried since she was 11 years old. Then he straightened up and went to find her. She was sitting in the far corner of the lobby, reading nothing, looking at nothing, her hands in her lap with the same flat precision she'd shown in his office. When she saw his face, she stood immediately, reading it the way people who have learned to read faces for safety read them. "He talked," she said. "He talked." She closed her eyes for just a moment. When she opened them, there was something in them that had not been there before. Some small unburdening, the beginning of a weight being set down. She sat back down, and Sullivan sat beside her. And they stayed there in the quiet lobby of the county building while the late afternoon light moved across the linoleum floor. And he told her what Brooks had said. And she listened with the still, contained attention of someone who had been waiting a very long time to know that what they saw was real. The drive back to Coyote Flats that evening took Sullivan through 40 minutes of open desert highway, the kind of road that exists between places rather than leading to them. The landscape on both sides was blue-gray in the dusk, the saguaros standing like figures that had been waiting since before the road was built. He drove without the radio on, which he rarely did, and thought about Daniel Parker, dead since 2001, a property that had passed through a family trust and eventually to a development company in Scottsdale that had no idea what was underneath the dirt they'd been grading. A man who had killed 3 children, enlisted a frightened co-worker in hiding the evidence, and then lived on his property for another 11 years until a heart attack took him at 63, leaving behind a wife named Margaret, who had died in 2019. Sullivan thought about Margaret Parker, about the decade she had lived on that land after her husband's death, about what she might have known and when she might have known it. He picked up his phone from the passenger seat and called Reyes. "I need you to track down anything that belonged to Margaret Parker," he said. "Personal effects in storage, documents with the trust, anything held by a family member or attorney. I'm looking for journals, diaries, letters, anything written." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What are you expecting to find?" Reyes asked. Sullivan watched a hawk cross the highway in front of him, low and purposeful, heading into the last light. "I don't know yet," he said. But Margaret Parker lived on that property for a decade after her husband died. She either knew what he was, or she spent 10 years not knowing something she was very close to. Either way, she had opinions about it. People who live with that kind of proximity to something terrible Always write it down eventually. It's the only thing they can do with it that feels like anything at all. The journal was found in a storage unit in Cottonwood, rented by Margaret Parker's nephew, who had inherited the contents of her house when she died and had never sorted through them. It was a standard composition notebook, the black and white kind, its cover warped slightly from humidity, the pages inside dense with small, careful handwriting in blue ink. Sullivan read it at his kitchen table at 2 a.m, the only time the building was quiet enough to read something like that properly. He'd made coffee he didn't want, and opened all the windows to let in the night air, which was cool in the way Arizona desert nights are cool, with a sharpness to it that felt almost accusatory after the day's heat. Margaret Parker had started writing in the notebook in the spring of 2002, about 8 months after Daniel's death. She wrote about the farm first, the practical difficulties of managing it alone, the state of the equipment, the negotiations with the camp about the water access. She wrote about Daniel in the flat, careful way that people write about the recently dead when they are still deciding what they feel about them. She wrote about his silences, his long absences, his habit of walking the property boundaries after dark. Then, in an entry dated August of 2002, she wrote something that made Sullivan stop and read the passage twice. "I found the hatching today. The old storage building at the northeast corner that Daniel always kept locked. I had to break the padlock to get in because the key was never found among his things, and I needed access to the irrigation fittings inside. There is nothing unusual in the building itself, but the dirt floor has been disturbed at some point in the past. Not recently, long ago, and covered over carefully, but disturbed. I don't know what Daniel stored or buried in that building over the years. I have found it is easier not to know. I have always found it easier not to know." Sullivan set the notebook down and looked at the kitchen window, at the black desert night beyond the glass. Then he picked it up and kept reading. The entries continued for 7 years, through 2009. Margaret Parker was not an expressive writer. She recorded observations rather than feelings, details rather than conclusions. But across those 7 years, the observations accumulated into a portrait of a woman who had understood, slowly and without ever fully acknowledging it, exactly what her husband had been. In 2004, she wrote about hearing from a neighbor in Cottonwood that the family of one of the children missing from Redstone Valley had never stopped looking. She wrote this without comment and did not return to the subject. In 2006, she wrote about finding a bundle of newspaper clippings in a locked box in Daniel's desk. The clippings were about the missing children. She wrote that she put the box back where she found it and did not open it again. In 2007, in an entry that was different in tone from everything surrounding it, she wrote, "Daniel was not a good man. I knew this before I married him, and I married him anyway because I was 32 years old, and the alternative to marrying him was a kind of loneliness I was not brave enough to face. I am not brave enough for most things. I am not brave enough to call the sheriff's department in Yavapai County and tell them what I have not found and have not read and have not allowed myself to know. I hope God will judge me less harshly for my cowardice than I judge myself. I hope those children, wherever they are in a better place than this one." Sullivan closed the notebook and sat very still at his kitchen table for a while. Outside, something moved in the scrub, a coyote or a rabbit, or just the wind finding its way between the dry stalks of something. The desert was always moving at night, always shifting, always working at the slow business of making and unmaking itself. He thought about Margaret writing those words in 2007 and sitting with them and continuing to say nothing. He thought about Patricia Hartley's letter that his predecessor in some other county had once described to him at a conference. He thought about the category of people who knew terrible things and built careful structures of silence around the knowing, and lived inside those structures until the structures became the only architecture they could imagine. Then he called Reyes and told her he needed a ground-penetrating radar team out to the Parker property by morning. All of it. Every structure, every outbuilding, every acre. He also told her to check missing children reports from Graham County, Gila County, and Cochise County from 1985 through 2001. Cross-reference every case involving children between the ages of 6 and 12 with Daniel Parker's known movements, property visits, equipment sales, and any other documented connection to those counties. Reyes was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. It was 2:40 in the morning. "How many are we expecting?" she asked. Sullivan looked at the composition notebook on his kitchen table, at Margaret Parker's small, careful writing visible on the open page. "I don't know," he said, "but more than 3. Hannah came to the Parker property site on a Thursday, 4 days after Carl Brooks had made his formal statement. Sullivan had called her and said she didn't have to come, but she came anyway. She stood beside him on the ridge overlooking the site, while the radar team moved methodically across the northeast quadrant, their equipment trailing shallow lines in the dust. "He used to bring me out here sometimes," she said. "Carl. He'd pick me up from school and drive me out this way and say he was showing me the desert. I think now that he was showing me the landscape the way men like him show you things, as a reminder that it's large and empty and that things disappear into it." Sullivan said nothing. He'd learned, over the years, that the best thing to do with a statement like that was to receive it without filling the space around it. "I thought for a long time that I was wrong about him," Hannah continued, "that I'd been a suspicious child with an overactive imagination. My mother believed in him absolutely, right up until he left her for the second wife in 1998. Even after that, she said he was a good man who'd made mistakes, not a bad man who'd done things." She paused. "She died in 2015, still believing that, I think. Do you think she knew? About the night you saw him?" Hannah considered this with the same careful weight she brought to everything. "I think she knew something was wrong and chose not to organize it into knowledge," she said finally. "There's a difference. I've seen it in my work. People who are in proximity to something that will destroy them if they look at it directly. They learn to look slightly sideways. They get very good at it over time." One of the radar technicians raised his hand and the team stopped moving. He marked a spot with a small orange flag. Then, 40 minutes later, another flag. Sullivan and Hannah stood on the ridge and watched the orange flags accumulate in the dust below, small bright points against the pale brown ground, each one marking where the earth had been disturbed, each one marking a place where something had been put down and covered over and left in the dark. By the end of the day, there were 6 flags on the Parker property. Combined with the 3 children already confirmed, they were potentially looking at 9 victims. Sullivan stood on the ridge as the sun went down and turned the red rock country to the colors of a wound. And he felt the particular exhaustion of a man who has found what he came looking for and cannot find it to be any kind of victory. Hannah stood beside him. After a while she took his hand, and he let her, and they stood together in the cooling evening air while the orange flags caught the last light below them. The formal press conference was held on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 months after Ernesto Vega's backhoe had opened the ground on Dillon Road. Sheriff Patricia Lowe stood at the podium in the Yavapai County building and read the prepared statement in a steady voice. and Sullivan stood to her left and listened to the language of official closure. Daniel Parker was being named as the primary suspect in the deaths of 8 confirmed victims, all children ranging in age from 6 to 11, whose remains had been recovered from the Parker property and from 2 other sites linked to Parker's known history. The investigation into additional cases was ongoing. Carl Brooks had pleaded guilty to accessory to murder after the fact, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence in connection with the deaths of Tyler Ramos, Caitlin Moore, and Owen DeLuca. He had been sentenced to 18 years. Sullivan watched the reporters in the front rows writing in their notebooks and thought about 18 years. Carl Brooks was 68 years old. His projected release date, accounting for good behavior, would place him at around 80. He would likely die in the prison medical unit, which was not nothing. But it was also not enough. And Sullivan understood that it would never be enough. And that understanding was something he had made his peace with over the years and would continue making his peace with. After the press conference, he drove to Hannah's apartment, which was in a quiet part of Prescott, with a view of the mountains. She'd moved there 3 months ago from the town where Carl Brooks had lived, the town where she'd spent 34 years not quite running from a memory she'd never let herself fully examine. She opened the door before he knocked, which meant she'd seen his car. She looked different than the day she'd walked into his office. Not lighter, exactly, because the weight of what she knew was not something that simply lifted, but different in the way that people look when they have stopped using energy to hold something down. More present, more entirely in the room. He told her about the sentencing. She nodded slowly, her expression doing the thing it did when she was processing something that required more space than a single reaction. "Is it enough?" she asked. "No," he said, "but it's what the system gives us." She made coffee, and they sat at her kitchen table and talked for a long time about small things, and then about larger things. And Sullivan felt something he had not felt in this work for longer than he could specifically name. Not resolution, because resolution was a fiction that investigations like this one did not produce, but a sense of having done the thing that the situation required, without flinching from it, and without pretending it was something other than what it was. When he got up to leave, she walked him to the door and stood in the frame while he walked to his car. And he turned once to look back at her, and she raised one hand in a small gesture that was not quite a wave. He drove out of Prescott on the highway, heading southeast. The mountains were purple and gray on his right, and the desert opened out flat and enormous on his left. And the sky above all of it was the particular deep blue of an Arizona afternoon that has not yet decided to become evening. He thought about 8 children. He thought about their names, which he had memorized, all 8 of them, the way he memorized the names of everyone he worked for. Tyler, Caitlin, Owen, Jessica, Marcus, Lily, Renee, David. He thought about Daniel Parker, who had died of a heart attack in 2001 at the age of 63, on the same land where he'd buried his victims, and had never spent a single day in custody for what he'd done, who had been described by neighbors as a quiet, reliable man, who had been married for 30 years to a woman who'd spent 10 years after his death writing in a composition notebook about the things she hadn't quite allowed herself to know. He thought about the press conference and the official language and the word closure, which reporters and officials used because there was no better word for a thing that was not actually closure at all, but was the nearest available approximation. And then Sullivan thought about something that had been forming in the back of his mind for 3 months, something he had been turning over without quite looking at directly, in the way that investigators sometimes do with the details that will eventually matter most. Roy Sutter, the camp director, the man who had done the final head count at 9 p.m. on July 14, 1990, and then reported 3 children missing the following morning. Sullivan had pulled his original statement from the archives and read it 3 times. He had interviewed Sutter twice, once by phone and once in person. Sutter was 71 now, living in Flagstaff, seemingly cooperative, appropriately distressed by the discovery of the children's remains. But Sutter's camp had been operating adjacent to Daniel Parker's property for 4 years before the disappearances. The 2 men had shared equipment access and water rights. In 2003, 2 years after Parker died, Sutter had sold the camp property. In the sale documents, recorded with the county, the buyer was listed. It was Margaret Parker's nephew, the same man who had stored Margaret's belongings in the Cottonwood storage unit, the same man who had inherited the trust. Sutter had sold the camp to Parker's family 2 years after Daniel Parker died, at significantly below market value, for reasons that had never been explained. Sullivan pulled onto the shoulder of the highway and stopped the car. He sat there in the cooling afternoon, looking out at the desert, at the way the light was doing what it always did to the landscape at this hour, flattening it and making it both more beautiful and more incomprehensible at the same time. Roy Sutter had sold his camp property to Parker's family 2 years after Parker's death, below market value, without any documented reason. Transactions like that, Sullivan knew, from 40 years of understanding how people behaved when they were managing secrets, did not happen without a reason. They happened when one party held something over another party. They happened when the terms of an arrangement between 2 people needed to be settled, at whatever price the settling required. He picked up his phone and called Reyes. "I need you to pull the financial records for Roy Sutter and the Redstone Valley Youth Camp from 1985 through 2003, he said. "And I need the property transfer documents from the 2003 sale. All of them. Every attachment." Reyes paused. "Sullivan, the case is officially closed." "The press conference was this morning," he said. "The case is officially closed." "So what are you doing?" He looked out at the desert. The sun was fully low now, and the sky at the horizon had gone the color of something burning at a great distance. "I'm doing what always happens," he said. "We close a case and we find out there was another door we didn't open." He ended the call and sat on the shoulder of the highway for another minute, looking at the light on the landscape, thinking about Roy Sutter and what he might have known, and when he might have known it, and what kind of arrangement a man makes with his conscience when he sells a piece of land at below market value to the family of someone whose secrets he has been keeping, and drives away and tells himself that closing a door is the same as there being nothing behind it. The official record would show that the case had been closed, that Daniel Parker, deceased, was the perpetrator, that Carl Brooks had been brought to justice, that 8 families had finally been given answers after decades of silence. The official record would not show what Sullivan knew as he pulled back onto the highway and headed into the burning evening light, that somewhere in Flagstaff, a 71-year-old man named Roy Sutter was watching the same news coverage that the rest of the state was watching, and was feeling, behind his appropriate public distress, something other than surprise. That the door Sullivan had not yet opened was still there. That it had always been there.